One bright and sunny day, the grand church in Newport was buzzing with excitement. It was the big day for Mr. Sayre Kamayahan, a wealthy and successful businessman, to marry Clara Sinclair, his glamorous fiancée. The church was packed with over 300 people, including important executives, local politicians, and the wealthiest people in the area. Everyone was dressed in their best outfits, ready for what they thought would be the wedding of the year. But as the minutes ticked closer to the ceremony, something didn't feel right. Clara was nowhere to be seen. The guests were whispering among themselves, wondering where the bride could be. Sayre, standing at the front of the church, was trying to stay calm, but he could feel the sweat on his forehead. The priest leaned in close and whispered, "Mr. Kamayahan, it's time. Should we start?" Before Sayre could respond, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, hoping it was Clara explaining her delay. Instead, his heart sank as he read the short message on the screen. "I'm sorry, I can't do this. Bye." Sayre's hands trembled as he reread the text. His chest tightened with humiliation and his face turned red. He could feel the stares of the guests, hear the whispers spreading through the crowd. Some people looked at him with pity, while others smirked, clearly enjoying the drama. Sayre felt like he was standing in the middle of a bad dream. Desperate to escape the embarrassment, Sayre's eyes darted around the room. That's when he spotted Lila Bennett, his housekeeper for the past 3 years. Lila was standing quietly near the side door, dressed in a simple navy blue dress. She had always been discreet and respectful, and now her warm brown eyes were filled with genuine concern. Unlike everyone else, Lila wasn't whispering or smirking. She just looked worried for him. Without thinking, Sayre marched over to her. "Lila," he said, his voice low but urgent, "marry me." Lila's eyes went wide with shock. "Mr. Kamayahan, are you serious? You're not thinking clearly." "I am serious," Sayre said, grabbing her hands. "Please, Lila, I can't stand the thought of walking out of here as the man who got left at the altar. You're the most loyal person I know, please." Lila glanced nervously at the crowd. Everyone was staring at them now. She had worked for Sayre for years, and she knew he wasn't as confident as he appeared. Behind his polished image was a man who carried deep scars, like the pain of his mother leaving him as a child. Lila hesitated for a moment, then said softly, "Yes." The room erupted in gasps and murmurs. Some guests stood up and stormed out, outraged by what they called a scandal, but many stayed, too curious to leave. In a matter of minutes, the priest adjusted his notes, and Sayre and Lila stood at the altar together. Lila walked down the aisle wearing a borrowed wedding dress, her heart pounding with disbelief. The ceremony was quick and quiet, and when it was over, the guests headed to Sayre's grand mansion by the ocean for the reception. Lila stood in the garden, now wearing Clara's elegant dress, trying to process what had just happened. Sayre approached her, holding 2 glasses of champagne. "You saved me today," he said, handing her a glass. "I know this is crazy, but I promise I'll make it up to you." "What happens now?" Lila asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sayre took a deep breath. "We'll stay married for a while, just until people forget about this whole mess. Then we can quietly get a divorce." Lila nodded, even though her chest felt tight at the thought. She didn't understand why, but the idea of their marriage being temporary made her sad. The next morning, Lila moved into the master bedroom of Sayre's mansion, while he stayed in one of the guest rooms. During the day, she kept running the household as she always had, managing the staff and keeping everything in order. But in the evenings, she had to attend fancy parties and events, pretending to be Sayre's loving wife. At first, everything felt awkward, but over time, Leila started to see a different side of Sayre. He wasn't just the distant, busy boss she had known. In the quiet moments they shared, Sayre began opening up to her. One night, Lila was curled up in the library, reading a copy of Pride and Prejudice. Sayre walked in and raised an eyebrow. "I didn't know you liked Jane Austen," he said, sitting down across from her. Lila smiled faintly. There's a lot about me you don't know. Like what? Sarah asked, genuinely curious. Well, Lila said, closing her book, I studied literature in college, but I had to drop out because of financial problems. Sarah looked at her with new respect. You studied literature? I didn't know that. You never asked, Lila replied with a small smile. Despite their growing friendship, life wasn't easy. Clara's mother started a smear campaign against Lila, posting mean things online and accusing her of being a gold digger who had planned the entire situation. Lila tried to ignore it, but one day she broke down crying in the garden. Sayre found her there and knelt beside her. Don't listen to them, he said firmly. You're better than all of them. Why do you care? Lila asked, wiping her tears. I'm just your maid who agreed to this crazy plan. No, Sayre said softly. You're the only person who's ever been kind to me without expecting anything in return. One morning over breakfast, Sayre announced, I've hired a new housekeeper. You don't need to run the household anymore. Lila froze. Her job wasn't just a job, it was her identity and her independence. So what am I supposed to do all day? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Well, most executives' wives do charity work or join clubs, Sayre began, but he stopped when he saw the look on her face. Sorry, that sounded condescending. Lila sighed and thought for a moment. What if I take on the restoration project for the Newport Public Library? It's meaningful, and I'd actually enjoy it. Sayre's face lit up. That's a great idea. Lila threw herself into the library project, and her hard work quickly paid off. She impressed everyone with her knowledge and dedication, even the library director. Your wife is extraordinary, the director told Sayre one day. That evening, Sayre picked Lila up from the library. She was glowing with excitement as she told him about her plans for digitizing rare books. Sayre listened quietly, amazed by her passion. You surprise me every day, he said as they drove home. Lila glanced at him. That's because you never bothered to get to know me before. Just when things were starting to settle down, Sayre's grandmother, Vivienne Kamayahan, announced she was coming to visit. Vivienne was a sharp, no-nonsense woman known for her ability to see through lies. She'll be here tomorrow, Sayre said nervously over breakfast. Lila felt a pang of panic but quickly composed herself. Then we'll just have to be more convincing than ever. That night, they sat in the library rehearsing their fake love story. Our first date was right here, Leela suggested, gesturing to the library. You were reading Pride and Prejudice, and I was intrigued, Sayre added, smiling. For a moment, the practice felt real, and Lila wondered if the line between pretense and reality was starting to blur. At a fancy dinner, a snobby socialite asked Lila, How did you manage to win over Sayre so quickly? Before Lila could answer, Sayre stepped in. Actually, I had to win her over, he said with a charming smile. She turned me down 3 times before agreeing to coffee. Lila felt his arm slip around her waist, and for a brief moment it felt natural. That night, back at the mansion, Sayre stared into the fireplace while Lila sat beside him. Thank you for standing up for me tonight, she said. I was just telling the truth, Sayre replied, his voice soft. You're the kind of person who's worth fighting for. Lila felt her heart skip a beat. Good night, Sayre, she said, standing to leave. Good night, Leela, he replied, his eyes following her as she walked away. In their separate rooms, they both lay awake, wondering how a fake marriage had started to feel so real. The next morning, Vivienne arrived at the mansion, and it was full of activity. Even at 78 years old, she still held herself with grace and had a sharp eye for details, making her one of Boston's most respected women. Over lunch, Vivienne studied Lila carefully with her blue eyes and asked, Tell me how my grandson finally found someone who made him forget about that Sinclair girl. Lila felt her friend Sayre gently squeeze her hand under the table. Actually, Mrs. Kamayahan, it wasn't sudden, Lila said. Sayre and I really got to know each other through books and literature. Vivienne raised an eyebrow. Really? She asked, clearly interested. Yes, Sayre added. Lila knows a lot about classical literature. She's even helping to restore the public library. Vivienne was quiet for a moment, but then said, interesting, in a way that made Lila feel like she wasn't completely convinced. The next few days were tricky for both of them. During the day, Lila worked hard at the library, but she knew Vivienne was always watching. At night, she and Sarah had to pretend they were in love, even though things didn't always feel fake anymore. They started sharing small touches, looking at each other during dinner, and talking late into the night. It didn't feel like acting anymore. It felt real. One evening, Vivienne saw them from the balcony and said, "You two are terrible actors, but maybe that's why I believe in you." Lila and Sarah looked at each other, not sure what to say. Vivienne smiled and explained, "Couples who pretend to be in love often make it obvious, but there's a different feeling between you two. It's not made up, it's real, even if you don't know it yet." Later, as they walked on the beach, Sarah said, "My grandmother was always very observant, but she might be wrong." Lila answered, "Maybe, but what if she isn't?" Before Sarah could respond, his phone rang. It was about Clara Sinclair, his ex-fiancée, asking to meet him. The moment between them faded away. Lila felt sad, reminded that their marriage was only for show. "You should go meet her," Lila said. "Maybe she wants to explain." "It's okay, Lila," Sayer said. "This is what we've been waiting for, right? To end this marriage." But as Lila walked back to the mansion alone, she realized that things weren't as simple as she had hoped. Her heart didn't follow the rules she had made. At the law office where Sayer met Clara, she apologized for leaving him at the altar, saying, "I realized we were getting married for the wrong reasons. Family pressure, business deals, and all that. I made a mistake. We can try again." Sayer felt conflicted, but said, "No, Clara, there's no going back. Some mistakes can't be fixed." Meanwhile, back at the library, Lila was working hard on the restoration project. She was distracted, though, thinking about Sayer and Clara. Dr. Bennett, a friend of hers, noticed and said, "Sometimes the most valuable things seem ordinary at first, like books. You have to look inside to see their true worth." Lila smiled, thinking about the people who choose to look beyond appearances. Suddenly, Vivienne appeared from behind some shelves. "We need to talk," she said. Lila followed her grandmother by law into the library garden, a small green area outside. Vivienne sat down and said, "You're in love with my grandson." It wasn't a question. It was clear to her. "Please, Vivienne, don't try to deny it," she added. "I see how you look at him when you think no one is watching." Lila felt her walls come down. That wasn't part of the plan. "Love rarely is," Vivienne said kindly. "I've been watching you these past few days. You're not just smart and capable, you're genuine. That's rare in our world." Lila frowned. "But not good enough for someone like Sayer." Vivienne smiled. "On the contrary, you're exactly what he needs. But the real question is, are you willing to fight for it?" Before Lila could respond, her phone buzzed with a message from Sayer. "We need to talk. Dinner at 8. Later that evening, when Lila arrived at the mansion, the dining room was filled with candles and her favorite flowers, white peonies. Sayer looked at her and said, "Clara wants to get back together." Lila froze, but managed to say, "I see, so we'll announce our separation." "No," Sayer said quickly. "I've realized something today. While Clara was talking about starting over, all I could think about was you." Lila's heart raced. "But maybe you're just grateful to me." "No, it's more than that," Sayer said, taking her hands in his. "You make me see the world differently. You make me see myself differently. You laugh when you're truly happy, and your eyes shine when you talk about books. You care about everyone around you without expecting anything in return." Tears started to fall from Lila's eyes. "But I'm afraid," she said softly, "afraid that one day you'll wake up and realize that you deserve someone better for your world." Sayer wiped away her tears and said, "My world was empty before you came into it, and I don't want to go back to that." Lila managed to laugh. "My grandmother said the same thing today." Sayre knelt down in front of her and asked, Lila Bennett Kamayahan, will you marry me again, but this time for love, not just for convenience? Before she could answer, Vivienne appeared in the doorway, clapping her hands. Finally, now we can plan a real wedding. Lila looked at Sayre, her heart full of hope. Yes, she said, pulling him into a kiss. 1,000 times yes. Vivienne smiled to herself and quietly left, leaving the couple to share their moment. Later, the news about Sayre's proposal spread all over Newport, but not everyone was happy. The Sinclair family, especially Clara's, was angry and wanted revenge. At breakfast, Lila showed Sayre an article from the Newport Daily News, questioning whether their marriage was real and suggesting an investigation. Sayre frowned. This is Clara's work. She's good at destroying people's reputations. What if they find out the truth about how we started? Lila asked, nervously. It doesn't matter how we started, Sayre said, covering her hand with his. What matters is where we are now. Later, at a meeting for Kamayahan Enterprises, one of the older shareholders, George Donovan, asked about Sayre's leadership. First a failed marriage, now a rushed marriage with a maid, he said, making investors nervous. Sayre stayed calm. My personal life doesn't affect my ability to lead. Last quarter's numbers prove that. Meanwhile, at the public library, Lila was dealing with her own problems. Charlotte Pierce, one of Clara's old friends, came by and said, It's interesting how some people rise to the top so quickly, almost like a modern fairy tale. Lila stayed calm, saying, I'm planning to return to my studies at Brown University next semester. Charlotte tried to embarrass her, saying, You dropped out, didn't you, for money reasons? Lila replied, I plan to go back and finish my degree. Just then, Sayre walked in, heard the conversation, and said, I fully support Lila's decision to continue her studies. He kissed her forehead gently, showing his full support. Later, in the privacy of his home office, Sayre asked Maya why she hadn't told him about her plans to go back to university. Maya admitted that she hadn't decided yet because she was still thinking about it. She explained that when Vivienne mentioned Sayre's connection to Brown University, she started to think about it more, but she didn't want people to think she was using their marriage for her own benefit. Sayre pulled her close and said, You're my wife. Your success is my success. But just then, Vivienne called with urgent news. When she arrived at the mansion an hour later, she said, Clara is pregnant. Sayre was shocked. Vivienne continued, She says the baby is yours. The room was silent. Maya felt like the floor had disappeared beneath her. Sayre looked pale and said, That's impossible. Clara and I haven't been together in at least 6 months. Vivienne explained, She's telling everyone that you're the father and Caroline Lancaster is already planning a press conference. Maya watched Sayre's face change from shock to anger, then to determination. I'll handle this, he said, holding Maya's hand tightly. No, Maya said softly. We'll handle this together. Vivienne smiled, watching them. You two have grown so much since your impromptu wedding, and maybe that's exactly why people want to break you up. That night, as a storm raged outside, Sayre and Maya stayed awake in the library. They had been using the library as their safe place since the beginning. The rain pounded against the windows as they planned what to do next. I won't let them destroy what we've built, Sayre said, his fingers interlaced with Maya's. Even if it means facing your whole social circle? Maya asked. Especially that, Sayre smiled. When Clara left me at the altar, I thought my life was over. But now I know it was just the start of something real, something true. Their words felt like promises, stronger than the thunder outside. What had started as a marriage of convenience had turned into a strong love that no one could break. Vivienne, watching them from the door, smiled. She thought to herself, sometimes the greatest stories start in the most unlikely ways. Inside the Kamayahan mansion, two hearts had found shelter in each other. They proved that true love was stronger than scandals or social threats. The next day, At the Newport Harbor Hotel, a press conference was about to begin. The room was filled with reporters and people from the high society of Newport. Everyone was waiting for the scandal of the year. Before the press conference started, Sayre and Maya were in a nearby room getting ready. Vivian had hired Martin Walsh, the best defamation lawyer in the area. He was looking over his plan with the couple. "We have proof that Clara was in Europe when she says she got pregnant," Martin explained, showing them travel records. "She was at a spa in Switzerland." "Why would she do that?" Maya asked, worried. "There's always more to the story," Vivian said, walking in with a folder. "I've just found out that Sinclair Industries, Clara's family business, is almost bankrupt. Marrying Sayre would save her family's business and give her social status." Vivian added, "Desperate people make mistakes." Sayre nodded, "And we're about to show everyone her mistake." Maya stayed calm, even though things were getting worse. She was wearing a navy blue dress that made her look elegant, even in such a chaotic moment. "You don't have to go through this," Sayre whispered, holding her hand. "I'll face them alone." "No," Maya replied firmly. "We're a team now, for better or worse." When Caroline Lancaster stood up to speak, Clara was beside her, showing a small bump under her dress. Silence filled the room. But before Caroline could start, Vivian stepped up to the podium. "Before Caroline continues," Vivian said, "I want to share some interesting facts about Miss Sinclair and her supposed pregnancy." Vivian presented travel records, medical papers from the Swiss spa, and even an audio recording of Clara talking about her plan with someone. Caroline screamed, "That's defamation! I'll sue all of you!" Martin, the lawyer, calmly replied, "We'll be happy to present all this in court." Clara's plans started falling apart. She dropped her victim act and said, "You've ruined everything." Maya responded calmly, "Happy endings don't come from lies." The press conference turned into a media frenzy, and the real story was published. Not about a woman who stole a groom, but about a woman who tried to destroy a marriage for money. Later that night, in the Kamayahan Mansion's library, Sayre found Maya staring at the fire. "You were amazing today," he said, sitting next to her. "You kept your dignity, even when they tried to ruin it." Maya leaned back against him. "I've learned that true strength comes from within, especially when you have to survive." Sayre smiled and said, "That's why I love you. Not just for who you are, but for making me want to be better." Maya looked at him, surprised. "Do you really mean that? Every word?" Sayre said. "What started as a deal turned into something real, something true." Vivian, passing by, overheard their conversation and smiled. Her plan had worked. Not only had they exposed Clara's lies, but it also made Sayre and Maya's bond stronger. "Now we can finally plan that vow renewal," Vivian said as she walked into the room. "Something small, just close family. No 300 guests this time." Sayre laughed. "No more big weddings for us." Maya smiled. "Just real family." Family meant a lot to both of them. Maya had lost her parents young. Sayre had always tried to find approval in the wrong places, and Vivian had always wanted a daughter. The crisis had ended, but it brought more than just justice. It brought unity and growth. It showed them that sometimes life's best gifts come disguised as challenges. The next morning, as Newport woke up, the Kamayahan mansion felt full of energy. The scandal had turned into a victory, and what had started as a lie had become the truth. The scandal involving Clara was gone, but its impact still echoed through Newport's high society. For Sayre and Maya, though, it brought clarity about their relationship and future. One Thursday morning, Maya found a letter on her desk in the public library. It was a reply from Brown University about her application. Her heart raced as she opened it. "Accepted," she exclaimed, tears of joy running down her face. "I knew you could do it," Dr. Bennett said with a smile. "You were always meant for more than just cataloging old books." That evening, Sayre organized a small celebration at the mansion. Vivian, Dr. Bennett, and a few close friends gathered in the winter garden. The soft lights danced among the flowers Maya loved. "A toast to our future literature graduate," Sayre said, raising his glass, "and to the courage to start again." Vivian smiled proudly as she watched Maya talk to the guests. She gently pulled Maya into a quiet corner of the garden. "I have a surprise for you," she said, handing Maya an envelope. Inside, Maya found a piece of paper. It was the deed to a small bookstore in the historic part of Newport. "What's this?" Maya asked, surprised. "It's your next adventure," Vivian smiled. "The owner is retiring and wants someone who loves books to take over. I thought it could be a fun project for you while you finish your studies." "But how can I run a bookstore, study, and be your wife?" Maya asked softly. Vivian smiled again. "The same way you do everything else, with grace, determination, and the smarts that made me fall in love with you." Before they could talk more, Caroline, the florist, arrived late with some surprising news. She showed Maya a post on a local gossip blog saying that Maya had only gotten into Brown University because of the Kamaihan's help. Even though the post didn't show who wrote it, it was clear that Caroline Lancaster, who didn't like Maya, was behind it. "Ignore it," Vivian said, sensing the tension. "Some people just try to bring others down." But Maya shook her head. "No, it's time to show who I really am." In the next few days, Maya worked hard on the bookstore project. She kept the old wooden shelves and floors, but added some new touches. There was a cafe on the second floor, spaces for book clubs, and a section just for local authors. "You're creating more than a bookstore," Dr. Bennett said during a visit. "You're building a home for people who love books." The grand opening of Bennett and Books happened just as Maya started her classes at Brown. She balanced her studies, the bookstore, and her life with Ethan in a way that amazed everyone. "How do you do it?" Sophia, a classmate, asked one day after a tough Victorian literature class. "When you really love something or someone, you find strength you didn't know you had," Maya answered, thinking about how much her life had changed in the past year. At home, her relationship with Ethan kept getting stronger. Evenings that used to be cold and distant were now full of real conversation. They talked about books, business, and their dreams, building a real partnership. "You know what I love most about you?" Ethan asked one evening. "It's that you've never lost who you are, even with all the changes in your life." "Maybe because I finally found people who love me for who I am," Maya replied, leaning back against him. One day, Maya heard that Caroline Lancaster had left Newport to take a break in Europe. Clara, her friend, had started therapy and was now working for a group that helps women. "People can surprise us," Vivian said one evening at dinner. "Sometimes we need to fall to learn how to get back up." Maya asked, "How did you know?" Vivian smiled, her eyes full of wisdom. "I saw two lonely hearts finding each other, even in strange ways. True love doesn't follow a set plan." That night, after dinner, Ethan found Maya on the balcony, looking at the lights of Newport Harbor. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "How unpredictable life is," Maya replied, holding his hand. "A year ago, I was just your housekeeper, saving money to go back to school. Now I'm your wife, a business owner, and about to graduate." "I couldn't be prouder of you," Ethan said, kissing her forehead. Soon, Bennett and Books became one of the most popular places in Newport. One autumn afternoon, as Maya was organizing a book signing, she saw someone standing among the shelves. It was Caroline Lancaster. They stared at each other for a moment before Caroline spoke. "Can we talk?" Caroline asked, her voice quieter than usual. Maya led her upstairs to the private office. "I came to apologize," Caroline said. "My time in therapy made me realize how much harm I caused by trying to protect Clara and our social status. You created something real here, something we couldn't do." Just as the conversation was ending, Ethan walked in to pick up Maya for her first speech at Brown. "I was just leaving," Caroline said, heading toward the door. But she stopped, turned around, and said, "You two prove me wrong. You have something real." After she left, Maya felt her hands shaking. Are you okay? Ethan asked, wrapping his arms around her. I am, Maya answered, breathing deeply. It feels like a difficult chapter in my life is finally ending. At Brown, Maya spoke in front of over 200 people about the importance of independent bookstores. Books aren't just stories printed on paper, she said. They are bridges between people and different worlds. A bookstore is more than a place to buy books. It's a place of possibilities. Ethan and Vivienne watched proudly from the front row. Dr. Bennett, who had helped her along the way, smiled like a proud father. It's amazing how she does it all, Vivienne commented. Her studies, the bookstore, and still has time for us. Ethan smiled. I agree. And we're also planning our vow renewal for next month. This time, it'll be for love, not just for convenience. After the speech, a student came up to Maya and said, Your story inspired me. It showed me that we can start over and not let others decide who we should be. Sometimes our greatest growth comes when we are true to ourselves, Maya replied. Later, when Maya went back to the Kamayahan mansion, she found a surprise in her room. It was a first edition of Persuasion by Jane Austen, her favorite book. Ethan had found it at an auction in Boston. I thought it would be perfect for your collection in the bookstore, he said. It's perfect, Maya whispered, feeling a wave of emotion. Just like us. As the day of their vow renewal came, Maya thought about how much her life had changed. She was no longer the housekeeper trying to make ends meet. Now she was a businesswoman and a student with a bright future. Ethan asked, What are you thinking about? How sometimes the happiest endings begin with the most unlikely starts, Maya replied, leaning against him. If Clara hadn't run away that day, I never would have realized that the perfect woman for me was right in front of me all along, he said, kissing her forehead. Vivienne, who overheard their conversation, smiled. She knew that Maya and Ethan had proved that love doesn't care about social barriers or expectations. They had written their own story, one chapter at a time. Ethan said softly, You know what I love most about you? You never tried to fit in. You just were yourself. That's because I've learned that our story doesn't have to follow a plan, Maya replied. Sometimes, the best stories are the ones we write ourselves. The morning of their vow renewal arrived, golden light filling the sky. Maya watched as the garden at Bennett and Books was transformed into a magical place with flowers hanging from the bookshelves. Vivienne was making sure everything was perfect. This is much more meaningful than our first wedding, Maya said, remembering how rushed it had been. Vivienne handed Maya a small blue velvet box. Inside was a sapphire brooch shaped like a book. It was my grandmother's. She was a book lover too, Maya gasped. I can't accept this. You can, Vivienne said. You've brought something back to our family that we lost, authenticity. As the ceremony began, soft music played. The guests, all close friends and family, had brought books instead of gifts. Dr. Bennett, who would marry them, found Maya in the office. Are you nervous? He asked. No, Maya answered, adjusting her brooch. This time, I know exactly where my heart is. On the other side of the bookstore, Ethan was waiting with his own surprise. He had spent months working on a special project, a handmade book telling their story, with photos and notes from their journey together. It's more than just a gift, he said. It's a testament to how love can grow in the most unexpected places. As the ceremony began, the soft light of lanterns filled the garden, the smell of old books mixed with flowers, creating a cozy and intimate atmosphere for everyone. Lila walked down the aisle, passing all the books that had been important in her life. Some were old stories that helped her when she felt sad, and others were new books that gave her ideas for her own love story from a year ago. Sayre started his vows, his voice full of feeling. I thought my life was a sad story, he said, but you, Lila, turned it into something much more beautiful and real than any book I've ever read. Lila, holding a small notebook with her own vows, took a deep breath. They say the best books surprise you on every page, she said. Our story started as something we had to do, but it turned into the best love story I could ever dream of. Dr. Bennett, who was leading the ceremony, looked moved as he spoke. Love, like great books, has the power to change lives. When it was time to exchange rings, Lila and Sayre chose new ones together. The sun was setting and its golden light filled the room. At the party, guests shared their own love stories, making the room feel full of warmth and connection. Caroline Lancaster, standing quietly at the back, watched the celebration with a mix of sadness and respect. She softly said to Vivienne, "Sometimes you have to lose something to understand how important it was." Vivienne nodded. The important thing is to learn from the past and make a better future. As soft music played, Sayre found Lila in the poetry section, reading a book of Pablo Neruda's poems. "I found you," he smiled, giving her a book he had prepared. Lila opened the leather cover, her hands shaking slightly as she saw pictures and words about their journey together. The last page was empty except for the words "future chapters," showing that their story was far from over. Sayre kissed her forehead gently. The sound of clinking glasses made him look toward the party, where Vivienne was getting ready to give a toast. "Lila and Sayre remind us," she said, raising her glass, "that the best stories are the ones written from the heart, not from what society expects." The guests clapped, and Lila and Sayre exchanged a special look, knowing that they had created their own love story. The evening went on, and lanterns in the garden made soft shadows. The bookstore, full of books with thousands of love stories, felt like the perfect place for everyone to just be themselves. A year later, the bookstore, Bennett and Books, had grown and added a new space for events and writing workshops. Lila, now a graduate from Brown University, ran the bookstore and worked on writing her own story. "It's strange to write about your life," Lila said one evening while she worked on her notes in the library. "How do you put into words something that changes you so much?" "Maybe that's why it needs to be told," Sayre said gently, massaging her shoulders to help her relax. "Sometimes the best stories are the ones life writes for us." But not everything was peaceful. One morning they got bad news. Kamaihan Enterprises was facing a takeover by a big company in Seattle. The shareholders wanted Sayre to sell, saying he was too sentimental to run the company. Sayre confessed to Lila and Vivienne during dinner, "They say I've been making decisions that put people before money, but it's the right thing to do." Vivienne raised an eyebrow. "But since you started taking better care of your employees and the environment, the company's been doing better." Lila looked at Sayre with concern. "Maybe it's time to show them that caring for people and making a profit can go together," she suggested. Over the next few weeks, while Sayre fought to keep control of his company, Lila worked on a secret project with help from Dr. Bennett and some researchers from Brown. She collected data about how Sayre's changes in the company had improved the lives of the workers and also helped the company grow. On a rainy spring day, Lila gave a powerful presentation to the board of directors. "The true value of a company," she said, "isn't just measured in Myars. It's about the impact it has on people and the community, the families it supports, and the dreams it helps come true." After a moment of silence, the room burst into applause. George Donovan, a shareholder who had once doubted Sayre's leadership, spoke up. "Perhaps," he said, "we didn't understand the power of a more caring way to do business." The takeover attempt was stopped, and Sayre's policies were not only kept but expanded. Soon, the story spread, and the company's new way of doing business became famous. At home, Lila and Sayre celebrated with a special bottle of wine kept by Vivienne. Sayre smiled at Lila. "How do you always know what to do?" Lila smiled back. "I learned from books that the best stories are the ones where the characters find strength in their weaknesses. And you taught me that sometimes we need to fight for what we believe in, even when it seems hard," Sayre replied. Vivienne, listening from the doorway, smiled. You know, she said, when I planned your wedding, I had a feeling about you two. Lila, surprised, asked, You planned it? Vivienne laughed softly. Let's just say I had a feeling for a long time. I knew you two were meant to be together. Sarah looked at her, amazed. So you knew I would run away from my first marriage? Not exactly, Vivienne replied, but I knew the woman for you wasn't the one you were with. I knew Lila was the one for you. As rain softly tapped on the library windows, the three of them laughed together. What had started as a forced arrangement had turned into a beautiful love story that changed their lives. Vivienne raised her glass and said, To all the stories not yet written. Lila and Sarah shared a look, knowing their journey was far from over. Bennett and Books had grown into a place where books and people came together to change the world. Kamayahan Enterprises was now a shining example of how a company could succeed by caring about people, not just money. Later that night, Lila smiled at Sarah. You know what I love most about our story? She asked. Each chapter brings us closer to who we truly are. Sarah kissed her tenderly. And the best part, he said, is that we still have so many blank pages ahead of us. In the quiet library, surrounded by books that held thousands of love stories, Lila and Sarah had written their own. Their love story showed that sometimes the best endings begin in the most unexpected ways, and that love has the power to change hearts and even the world. Thank you for watching. If you like this story and want to see more, please subscribe to our channel. That way, you won't miss any new videos. Give us a thumbs up if you enjoyed it and share what you think in the comments. We love hearing your thoughts. Also, don't forget to check out the other videos on our channel. We'll see you in the next story.